there's a sense that China is in the kind of early stages of developing their own traditions, or not just that it's not that they don't have traditions. They have an extremely long 2,000-year tradition, but they're in the stages of kind of making sense of sort of what that means to the present and their relationship between Chinese modernity and the past. And in this kind of phase of construction, there's a need to look to other examples of how other civilizations relate to their past that they can take inspiration from.
Chang Che, one of the hottest up-and-coming freelance China reporters in the game. This episode will get into the Shanghai lockdown, Wang Huning, a.k.a. CCP Rasputin, a.k.a. Communist Qutb, talk about classics in China, Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, how the West is doing covering China, and maybe talk about some video games? I don't know. We'll see what we get into. Chang, welcome to China Talk.
Thanks, Jordan. Happy to be here.
So we're recording this on April 5th, 2022. So I hear you have some family currently living through the ordeal that is the Shanghai lockdown. What's your latest take on the situation?
So we're currently at day 6 of a 4-day lockdown on the west side of Shanghai. We're also on day 10 of a 4-day lockdown on the east side of Shanghai. And you can just imagine, based on what I just said, that things aren't going well. As you said, I have family there, and a lot of them, I have family and friends who I've talked to over the past few days, and they're all, frankly scared at the intensity of the response. I think the biggest problems that I've been hearing is not that the lockdowns have happened, even though I think, for most people in the world, that would be a problem, especially in places that we've lived in, but just how it was handled. There is just an opacity to, first of all, there's no idea when the lockdowns will be lifted. As it was promised that each side of Shanghai would have 4 days, and it's well past that now. And there is simply, a failure to offer, just basic necessities. So, a lot of my family and friends are worried about, running short on food because they had initially planned for just 4 days. And now that it's been extended, we don't know, how long, the food supplies are running short. The government did provide, and this was an interesting, I don't know if you saw this on Twitter, but, the government did provide a package of food, of vegetables to, I think, every household in Shanghai, which was an astonishing feat. But even that package could only last a few days. And so, the situation does not look very good at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me spending time in Shanghai. It just, you kind of forget that you're, in a CCP run country. And I just remember the sort of like, in some central square or something, you have like, Buwang Chuxin, like, the sort of red phrases. And it seemed so discordant with the rest of the kind of vibe and ethos and landscape of the city in a way that, the rest of China doesn't necessarily. So when you have moments like this where like it is very clear to everyone that you are being, your life is being run by the Chinese government in a very real and tangible sense, particularly in the Shanghai context, it seems like like the cognitive dissonance comes to the fore more. Am I totally off?
Absolutely. I think there's also the distinction between this kind of westernized cosmopolitan Shanghai and the kind of austere political Beijing. And I think that dynamic has played out during these past few weeks. So in the beginning of March, Shanghai had already started to log more cases than they had, since the pandemic began in 2020. And at that time, there was this kind of soft, partial lockdown procedure where certain neighborhoods would be locked down for certain periods of time based on cases. And I think at that time, Shanghainese were pretty accepting of that situation. And it was clear at the time that, this was a Shanghai affair, i.e. Shanghainese, officials were governing Shanghai.
Yeah.
That has changed significantly in the past week. So I think one of the biggest sort of shocking revelations that came out sort of end of March when the initial 2-part lockdown began and now has been extended well beyond indefinitely, basically, is that it's moved up the chain of command in
Sure.
the government, and Shanghai has basically become, as you know, so in April, Sun Chunlan, who's the vice premier, came down to Shanghai and is effectively sort of taken over. And A, that means that the situation's gotten much more political, and B, to your point, Shanghainese felt that they had it under control, but then suddenly it was arrested from their hands and taken into, Beijing. And I think, it's quite clear based on the people that I talked to that they feel that it's out of their hands, and now Shanghai is now in the hands of Beijing.
Well, all the best to your family, and let's hope however this gets resolved, it gets resolved in a way where the least sort of human pain and suffering is involved. As someone who's just getting over their COVID bout, it is a particularly kind of discordant thing to hear folks around the world talking about the only solution in China being to let it rip, because it's not a particularly pleasant thing, and lots of people will die. And I think it's important when thinking about zero COVID in China is like is for all the griping about that the world has about it. There have been millions of deaths prevented by figuring out a way to control COVID, and the decision to sort of turn that off is a really tricky and difficult one. So watching a system sort of struggle its way towards whatever the next stage of policy will be. Not often do I have a ton of sympathy for the CCP, but this in particular seems to be a really, really difficult conundrum to try to work your way out of.
There is a very public health reason why Shanghai needs to have their cases under control. 26 million is a lot of people, but China has 1.3 billion people. And a majority of the elderly population is, I'm not sure a majority, but a significant proportion of the elderly population is not vaccinated. There's not enough hospital beds. So there's very serious public health issues with an unrolling, sort of deterioration of zero COVID. The problem, I think, with the Shanghai lockdowns is just the way that it was handled. It was the notice for the 4+4 day lockdown in two parts. One on the 4 days on the left side, or on the east side of the city, 4 days on the west side. That was given in a day. There was only 1 day of notice for Shanghainese to prepare for that lockdown, which has now been extended. On that day, there were huge runs and lines outside grocery stores. And it looks like something out of like the Great Depression, like bank runs during the Great Depression. I mean, there was, entire grocery stores were completely emptied.
Yeah.
And the city was not ready. The people just weren't able to prepare basic necessities for something like this.
Yeah. So Chen Di, this journalist come Weibo blogger, had a riff a few days ago talking about how the way you get these incredibly harshly enforced policies is, at the bottom level, you may have some people who have he said, like, Liang Xin was the word, like people with a conscience. And then they ask their managers, like, hey, can I, help this person out? They need their meds. It's just one thing. And then maybe you find some middle managers that have a conscience and they're like, yeah, sure. But the more kind of exceptions and sort of, workarounds you get, then you have a top person come in and they look down at what's happening in the system and they wanted X, but they're seeing Y. And so then you get the word from the top, we're doing X, or I'm going to find someone else who can do X. And when you get that sort of, message in a system like a CCP run government, then all of a sudden, things change very quickly, and you have this kind of campaign style of governance where you have people, trying at all costs to kind of like, work towards the directive, right? And I think you're seeing some of the deficiencies really play out over the last week or so.
Yeah, absolutely. The directive from Beijing is clearly just one thing, which is get COVID under control. I think there was some news circulating that there was actually an explicit directive from Beijing to get Shanghai under control by April 11 at the latest. And so I think, as you said, that is the directive, and everything is going to go. The system is going to go all out in order to achieve it, at no matter what cost. And I think one consequence of what's happening in Shanghai is that the world, China is going to be more and more isolated from the world than it already is, because what's going to happen is Shanghai is going to get under control, because China is going to make sure that Shanghai gets under control no matter what cost. So the narrative from inside the country is going to be, we conquered Omicron, even though the West said that we wouldn't. We handled Omicron. The narrative on the West, as we've already seen in the past week, is Shanghainese, children are being separated from their families because of COVID. There's inhumane conditions at the quarantine hospitals. There's many, as I've been saying, a lot of people in Shanghai are unclear where their food is going to come from next in the next few days. That is going to be the story that really persists in the West.
I actually think it's still a real open question to what extent Omicron is really something that can be stopped, as if you're having a country which isn't having bi-monthly, multi-week lockdowns on a rolling basis.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. Wang Huning, who is he?
So Wang Huning is the most powerful political theorist in China. He's the 5th ranked member of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest ranking 7-member body of the Communist Party. And he's been in the air in the China world for about a year now, and he's sort of his name and notoriety has kind of spread throughout some intellectual circles in the West as well, partly because last year we witnessed a really sort of stark reversal in policies, for example, in the economy, but also, really drastic measures that were taken in the education sector, in areas of culture and technology. And so all of these changes have sort of amounted to this view, I think, from a lot of China observers, that China is going in a different direction than what we had initially expected. And oftentimes the people that we look at are those who are ideologues, people who have thought through, what is this direction that China might be taking that is clearly sort of antithetical to Western wisdom. And Wan has come up as a person who sort of since the 80s and 90s has been thinking about that very question.
So Wang Huning, like Xi Jinping, spent a little time in the U.S. She seems to have kind of enjoyed himself in Iowa back in the day. But it seems like Wang had a pretty different experience that left a rather sour taste in his mouth. So what exactly was it that turned him off so much about America?
So first of all, it's important to maybe contextualize when he came to America. So Wang came to the United States on a tour for 6 months in the sort of late 1980s. The story that I wrote in the New Yorker was effectively about his time there, and the book that he wrote called America Against America that came out of that period. And the book is effectively just a kind of memoir of his time, but it's a deeply sort of scholarly, intellectual memoir about him and his experience, almost like a kind of Tocqueville. And he mentions Tocqueville in the very beginning of the book. And it was clearly an inspiration for him to kind of do this sort of this grand philosophical work plus memoir type book, which came out to be America Against America. And as you said, his view of America was was broadly negative. I mean, I'd say that there were positives in it, and we can talk about some of the positives as well. But the points of emphasis that I chose to emphasize in the New Yorker piece was about his negative experiences. And I think there were a lot to focus on. The book is quite broad, but one element that really stuck out to me was the way that he described culture and this kind of loss of sort of cultural unity that he was experiencing in America in the 1980s. It's worth maybe contextualizing one aspect of what was going on during that time was it was kind of the beginning of a movement in universities to sort of rethink Western curriculums. So in 1988, I think like just right a year before he came, there was a famous protest at Stanford led by Jesse Jackson against the Western civilizations curriculum. And so a lot of the writers that he was drawing from, people like Alan Bloom, who is considered a sort of conservative philosopher, were writing in reaction to some of these cultural dynamics and cultural tensions in universities. So I think that was sort of one sort of element that informed his critical views of the United States.
Well, it's interesting thinking about, because this will tie into our conversation about classics in China later, is like, we have a generation that grew up being taught to hate the four olds. And then now when you have, it's not exactly the same thing that was happening in the US, sort of rewriting a great civilization curriculum, but for a sort of a CCP ideologue to come to the US and look at American sort of, America's version of trying to reimagine its cultural canon to be something that was negative as opposed to like positive and revolutionary and forward thinking is a really interesting dynamic, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, I think when he came to the United States, of course, Wang is theorizing as from the perspective of a Chinese intellectual, and in many ways, he is critical just because of the fact that he's not American and he's thinking about China's future. But he's also kind of envious, I think, of a kind of rich civilizational tradition that exists in this place called the West, right? And as you said, he's envious in part because China had sort of basically forsaken its past, and so he's writing in a period in the 1980s where the world is kind of China has opened up, right? There was a period of reform, and everything is on the table. But what he realizes is, why is America so great? He attributes part of his greatness to this rich tradition. And then he comes to the United States and he starts visiting, universities, and he realizes that the youth don't appreciate that. So what he had felt was missing in China, the youths were trying to destroy effectively. And so I think that had given him the views that he really wrote down in the book, which is that he thinks that, the future of America may not be so rosy if the youths do not revere Western tradition.
Chang, what else struck America about Wang?
I think what really struck Wang, besides all the cultural stuff, is just some of the positives, which is that the United States was a really powerful technological nation, right? So in the 1980s, there was a lot of the space shuttle program was launching. The Discovery had just been launched a year prior to his visit. So you get the sense that he was really struck by, the technology of the country, the space program he writes extensively about. He also wrote about, even the small things like pencil sharpeners and all these like electronic gadgets that he felt didn't exist in China at the time. And so I think he came to the conclusion that, there's this kind of innovative element of capitalism that he really appreciates, even though he sees sort of the downsides of capitalism as well. He also notices that, something about American ingenuity. He's also a little bit jealous of that, I think. I think he's also a little bit critical, and I think this is important to sort of contextualize his views of neo-authoritarianism, which is this kind of idea that he ends up developing in the 1980s in China, which kind of sets the course of Chinese development for decades forward, which is that you would have a kind of strong state government, a state capacity, an autocracy, effectively, while overseeing capitalist market reforms. And I think this view that he develops almost at the same time that he's writing America Against America makes a lot of sense if you read the book, because he's also being quite critical of American democracy. So he mentions, for example, that choices for presidency are not as freeing as one would expect in a country of democracy, right? You would think that the people, could choose their leaders, but in America, it was there was a whole list of reasons why that was not the case, right? There was, and of course, one hasn't. We know this, right? Because the founding fathers actually were trying to slow democracy down in some sense.
Sure.
But he observes this, right? So he says, there's a lot of interest groups that are sort of deterring people from choosing the right president. Choices for president in the end only come down to two. So he has a lot of critical views of democracy as well.
Syed Qutb, another self-styled intellectual who showed up from Egypt to hang out in America in the early 1950s, had a similar experience with sort of slightly different tenor, but also kind of focused on sort of moral and cultural degradation. And his writings ended up inspiring the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's gotten shout outs from Osama bin Laden and whatnot as a kind of this West is not something that we we as Islamists necessarily want to be emulating. I'm curious, Chang, you said you had some thoughts on the parallels. What's your take?
Yeah, I think I do. So when I first wrote, when the piece first came out, I got a lot of comments about, as you said, Syed Qutb and the similarities between him and Wang. And I think first let's just bring that out. Right. So the first very obvious fact of their similarities is that they're both kind of ideologues or theorists and philosophers who sort of have varying illiberal views or criticisms of the West. And they have empowered, illiberal actors and thinkers that are that are moving around in the world today. The second thing, I think, what's striking about, I think, both of them is that they both come from environments where the West hangs as its kind of specter. So Qutb sort of has his intellectual awakening during the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire has collapsed, and the West, and in this case, the European powers, are basically, carving out the Middle East. And Wang, he has his intellectual awakening during the Cultural Revolution, effectively. He grows up in Mao-era China, where the West has always been this kind of motivating force for the revolution. This kind of fear that the West might undermine Mao's revolution was certainly an element in why the Cultural Revolution began. So I think that they both see the West in varying degrees in a sort of negative sense. It's from very early on in their childhood. Yeah. The third, I think, important point is that they both come from environments that are highly morally charged. In a way that I think we in the West don't always recognize, because, for us, who grew up in liberal environments, there's a clear distinction between the private and public sphere, and you expect that there is no, insane propaganda or sort of moral conversation around, basic, experiences in the household and in just everyday society. That was not the environment that both of these thinkers come from, right? And, Qutb is coming from an Islamic environment. Wang is coming from literally, a cultural revolution where everything was politicized. And so I think, that is a really interesting way to look at how they both how they both sort of see the United States when they both come there. Now, it's important to also note that they're not going at the same time, right? Yeah. So they're about 50 years apart. Qutb, I think, visits I think in the 50s, and I think 50s, Wang is coming in the 80s, and so it's important to just separate the fact that these are very different times in American history.
The other thing that kind of struck me with Wang coming in the late 80s is most other youngish Chinese idealized America at the time, and the folks who did show up in the U.S., they didn't necessarily always see past the fact that America was rich and innovative and like shockingly rich from the perspective of coming coming off a plane or a boat. No, not off a boat, coming off a plane in the 70s or 80s. And, everyone sort of almost everyone young and intellectual in China at that time was toying with these ideas of what democracy and a more liberalized China would look like. And I think at the same time, Syed Qutb, he went to a British school for a number of years in Egypt. And, being an Islamist got you thrown in jail. It wasn't like the cool thing to do at the time. So it was very much a sort of, a counter consensus thing for both of them to come to the U.S. and have the reaction that they did.
Absolutely. But although I will qualify, I think, to your point about Wang, I think you're absolutely right about Qutb in the sense that, he died a martyr, right? He was executed because of his views, and he was very much in the margins during his time as a thinker. I don't think that was the case with Wang. You're absolutely right that in the 80s, there was this kind of fervor of economic liberalism and political liberalism. And Wang is certainly a little bit countercultural in that sense, but he was well liked by the establishment. So aside from Hu Yaobang, who very famously, former secretariat was of the former premier, who was clearly an antagonist in the story of Wang, who was the kind of, Hu Yaobang is known as this kind of reformer. He was well liked by people in the establishment, who, and that was why his journey to power began, because Jiang Zemin and his crew found that his philosophy really made sense to them. In effect, Wang was justifying what were effectively intuitions on the establishment intellectuals in China. And so that is a really important distinction, I think, that we want to make between Wang Huning and Syed Qutb, is that they're both ideologues, but Qutb was very much on the margins, whereas Wang Huning was already sort of mainstream in the inner workings of the party in the 80s and 90s, and he would become more and more mainstream as time goes on, such that he is now, at the very highest runs of the party.
Yeah, I mean, he was 34 in 1989, which is a really interesting age, right? Because he's not quite. He's young enough to have been toying with this stuff, but maybe, in the sort of like you're younger and you're liberal and you get more conservative as you get older. I think even before then, he had sort of chosen his side, right? The fact that there was someone providing the intellectual superstructure for the crackdown and a kind of response to Tiananmen, which he ended up being a real contributor to over the subsequent 30 years is it's just an interesting thing to think about.
It's also, I think, important one thing that I wanted to mention about Wang, and I think I may have not presented it as clearly in the New Yorker piece, is that Wang was also influenced heavily by Western thinkers. We often think of the West as like just everyone is all for liberal democracies, right? But the West is a very rich tradition, and Wang was extremely well read, and a lot of the thinkers that he ended up pulling from to sort of formulate his neo-authoritarian views were Americans.
Yeah.
So, for example, he drew from the work of Sam Huntington. And, Sam Huntington is quite popular now these days because we're interested in his views on the clash of civilizations because of the war in Ukraine. But before that, in the 1960s, he had written a really seminal work called Political Order and Changing Societies. And in it, he argues effectively that, Sam Huntington is this political scientist who had worked in the Carter administration, and he had observed a lot of societies on the kind of beginning stages. And his view was effectively, in the book, was that we needed to have, in societies that were just forming, democracy was not the main priority, right? What needed to be prioritized was order and stability, especially in critical sort of nascent stages of society. And Wang really seized upon that, I think, to sort of argue that in China's cultural context, it didn't make sense to basically, do a carbon copy or a copy of the Western model. We needed to look at, similar societies such as Singapore or Japan. And so he takes a lot of inspiration from other East Asian societies, I think in part because he is drawing from a lot of these Western thinkers who are at the time already critical of, democratization theory and these general views, this sort of grand views of liberal democracy being spread at a time when, the Cold War was ending and that kind of end of history view was very much in vogue.
By the way, Wang, if you're out there and listening, you got an open invitation to China Talk. Just get in touch. We'll make it happen. So, Chang, you also wrote this fantastic portrait of the study of classics in China. How'd you first come across this story?
So I had come from this story partly for personal reasons. As I told you before, I had been a student of Latin in high school, and I had spent 8 years studying it. And when I went to college, I hadn't taken classics in college, but what I noticed in, anyone from my generation who grew up in the American university system is well familiar with the arguments about the Western canon. And it began earlier in the 1980s, but when I was in university, it was very much a part of academic life and campus life. This was the period, throughout the 2010s, we had the period of there was the Rhodes Must Fall movement in the UK. There was the sort of renaming of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, the renaming of John Calhoun, and then in the beginning of last year, there was another big event associated with this, which was that the classics department at Princeton decided to effectively no longer require Latin and Greek courses for incoming majors. So, of course, it was this kind of a part of the culture wars. Everyone was talking about it. And at the time, I was reading, I was reporting and writing about China. And it just struck me that there was more enthusiasm for the Western classics in China than there was in the West. I mean, it was just a very clear division that I felt, just was worth writing about. And I think that was the initial beginning of how I ended up writing the piece.
So, Chang, you know who Wang Huning would really not get along with?
No, who?
Dan L. Padilla.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dan L. Padilla, and someone who I mentioned in the piece, is a classics professor at Princeton. There was a profile in the New York Times, I think in May of 2020, I want to say, where he was sort of described as a leader in this movement to kind of rethink the classics. And some of the arguments that he makes is that classics plays a significant role in the construction of what it means to be white. The way that white supremacists have used the classics, and anywhere from the way that we think about how do we justify slavery, has been used in reference to classical texts. So a lot of these arguments were sort of advanced in various ways by Daniel L. Padilla, and there was this piece in the New York Times profiling him about it. The reason why he is, I think, important to understand is because he's a person who represents a growing movement in the West to rethink tradition and to rethink, the foundations of Western tradition and what it means. And this is something that I think is really anathema to someone like Wang Huning, because Wang is, as we've mentioned, during his time in the 1980s visiting America, Wang had been really envious of the fact that America had a kind of rich, robust tradition that came from, in part, the great books and this idea of a Western civilizational course. All of these were things that he felt was lacking in China. And so to see, someone like Dan Padilla Peralta and just the entire anti-racist movement going against that, I think is certainly a really big shock for Wang Huning. And he wasn't in the 1980s when he was writing at the time. He had already diagnosed some of these issues. Because, as I said, this kind of movement against rethinking curriculums has been going on for decades in the United States.
Would this this sort of era of leaders, it all comes back to the Cultural Revolution, because that was the formative time, right?
Yeah.
And you know, to live through that, and then to have your response be, I can't believe anyone would even, it's funny because you have this kind of like right-wing critique in America that like all liberal academic thought is actually just trying to like create a cultural revolution in America, which is not. But if you're Wang Huning and you've lived through the Cultural Revolution, sort of any sort of left-wing critique of established tradition, it makes sense that it's going to, if you're someone who sort of still believes in the system, which he clearly does, any critique which is touching those sort of neuralgic points that the Cultural Revolution banged on for 10 years is going to resonate in a really negative way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to tie this back to the classics, I mean, I think this is partly an answer to the question of why the classics, the Western classics, but as well as the Chinese classics has grown in popularity in China. Because, Chinese are not interested in tearing down traditions. They've experienced that period of history, and they don't want anything to do with it. And Wang, in previous essays that he's written, has made this clear, that the Cultural Revolution is a kind of negative lesson for Wang and for a lot of the party leaders. Sure. And I think we can go into the details of this, but effectively, there's this kind of idea of construction rather than deconstruction, right? In this idea of tradition. Even the Western classics plays a role in building, I think, a sort of Chinese tradition in a kind of comparative sense. Not so much in, we're going to borrow the Western tradition, but just that idea of looking at the Western canon as an inspiration for how Chinese civilization should sort of relate to its past. I think that element is definitely there.
Sure. Let's explore that a little more.
Let's just start with a very basic question, right? Why is China interested in the Western classics? How did that happen? And there's two answers. The first answer is just that the college system has grown exponentially over the past 3 decades. And the more people in universities, the more options there's going to be, naturally. This period was also, the period of reform and open. There was a lot of exchange with Western universities. And naturally, Chinese universities are going to start looking a lot like Western universities because of that exchange, because of, students who are interested in studying and learning about the West. And so this is a period where it's not just the classics, right? There's a lot of disciplines that are developing that China did not have in the past. There's a whole bunch of disciplines from, Near Eastern studies to archaeology to art history. All of these disciplines are growing in size. So the second reason why classics is booming is, as I mentioned before, there's this sense that China is in the kind of early stages of developing their own traditions, or not just that it's not that they don't have traditions. They have an extremely long 2,000-year tradition, but they're in the stages of kind of making sense of sort of what that means to the present and their relationship between Chinese modernity and the past. And in this kind of phase of construction, there's a need to look to other examples of how other civilizations relate to their past that they can take inspiration from. And so that has been, I think, a project among a lot of classic scholars in China it's why a lot of classic scholars in China are really well read in the Greek and Latin and the Greco-Roman antiquity, is partly because, looking at Western tradition can help them understand how they should relate with their Confucian classics and Chinese classics. A lot of this has been done through the lens of another Western thinker named Leo Strauss.
Let's get into it. Leo Strauss. What's he all about?
So there's 2 ways to think about Leo Strauss, his role in China. And the first is actually quite practical. It's that he offers a way of reading the Western classics almost in a kind of simplistic way. And what I mean by that is Strauss is known as someone who didn't really have a regard for secondary sources. He had this view that you could just read the Western, you could read the classical text on it by itself and the meaning would be revealed to you. And I think that actually resonated with a lot of Chinese thinkers because one, that was kind of the way that they read the Confucian classics. The Confucian classics were also known to be just, the meaning of the text would kind of arise as you read it closely. And so I think his sort of interpretive philosophy of understanding the classics in the West really resonated with Chinese. And if you're thinking about it from a Chinese perspective, right, and you're looking out into the world and you're thinking about how to learn from, this entire wealth of knowledge that the West has to offer, it's really nice to have somebody kind of guide you through it. And it just so happened that, Strauss Strauss was translated in the early 2000s, or I think in the late 1990s in China. And he just happened to be somebody who was an easy person, an easy guide to much of the sort of Western classics.
Yeah. The nice thing about doing Straussian readings of classic texts is I remember, so I also did a lot of Latin in middle school and high school. And I remember getting to college and, initially I was like, oh, maybe I want to be a classic scholar. And then learned that like, oh, I actually also have to learn German. And like, I probably also need to learn French and Italian too, because like, there's like all this like other secondary literature that you have to do. And if you're Chinese and like, you've already spent all this time learning freaking ancient Greek and Latin, and then all of a sudden someone tells you have to learn all these Romance languages too, just to be able to sort of play the contemporary philology game. I would also kind of gravitate towards that. It's like, no, I want to get to the fun stuff. I want to read the text and tell you what they mean. Not kind of go down whatever the West has been twiddling their thumbs over the past 2,000 years.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. And so that there was a practical reason why he has taken off in China, but there's of course also an ideological reason. So I think the ideological side of it, I think the best way to understand it is through Strauss's disciples in the West, because Strauss is well known to be a kind of sort of a godfather of the neoconservative movement, and a lot of his disciples, called Straussians, he's more, I think in the media, a lot of it has to do with the role of Straussians in like the Bush administration and their role in Iraq. But there's, a lot of the Straussians were also sort of the last, like they were sort of like the last readouts of universities and their allegiance to the Western canon. So as the anti-racist movement sort of, reverberates throughout the 80s and 90s and tries to sort of remake curriculums, the Straussians are the ones who are standing, as Buckley said, standing athwart history, yelling stop. And some of these include, Alan Bloom, Harvey Mansfield. And all of these they're trying to protect effectively the Western tradition from progressives. And that, I think, really interested the translator of Leo Strauss named Liu Xiaofeng. So when he translated Leo Strauss, he had often mentioned this kind of, he had a deeply anti-Western progressive bent. He had this kind of view that the Chinese university was modernizing, but at the same time that it was modernizing, it was becoming more and more like Western universities. Almost the exact same thing that Wang Huning had feared in his book, that Chinese universities would suddenly become copies of what's going on, of the Western culture wars. That this idea that the culture wars would somehow be imported into China through universities. And Strauss becomes this way of thinking about why, progressivism has no place in China. Because, Strauss has, some of Strauss's views, most famously his views about the distinction between ancients and moderns in the West, helped him understand, Western modernity as a kind of negative thing and something that, Chinese universities should have no business dealing with. So that's the second reason.
So who's this guy Leopold Lieb?
So Leopold Lieb is actually a translator of Liu Xiaofeng. Actually, I should mention that. But he is also a faculty member at Renmin University, which is also where Liu Xiaofeng teaches. They're both in the same department, which is the School of Liberal Arts. And Lieb is also a classics instructor, but he has a very different personality from the translator Liu Xiaofeng. I mean, he is an Austrian, and he spent about 30 years in China so far. He began as he studied his PhD in Confucian studies, and then or Confucian philosophy, and now has been a classics teacher, instructor for, I think, going on 20 years. And Lieb is somebody who I chose to profile instead of, for someone like Liu Xiaofeng, in part because I wanted to just bring out the fact that, this is not all there is to the classics revival. So the classics revival is not entirely ideological. It is also a part of this story of Chinese youths and their interest in broader subjects. And I think Lieb really sort of brings that out, that, even though, we talk about China as a sort of place where the civil society is shrinking, that politics is, suffusing much of everyday life. There's also, the fact that there is a much larger population of Chinese youths who are interested in the world in ways that has never been the case. And Lieb really, I think, embodies this sort of reform era style openness to the world that I think still persists to this day.
Chang, you spent a fair amount of time talking to young students of this stuff. What did you hear from how they described their motivation of spending time learning declensions?
Yeah, so I think what really struck me about some of Lieb's students was, I think there was a lot of similarities between my experience, going to college, coming from an immigrant family and starting to go to college in the United States, and them, in the sense that I think their interest in Latin and the classics, happens just like anything else in college. You kind of stumble upon it. You're walking one day and you see it on the course offerings, and you're like, Oh, and I should mention that Lieb is quite popular in Renmin University. So a lot of people, I think a lot of upperclassmen would say to, some of the younger classmates, you should take this class. This guy is awesome. Like he's kind of a charismatic, well-loved figure in the school. But I think, a lot of these students have just kind of come across it by accident. But I think that they stay because it's just so new to them. And it's just this kind of entirely new world that opens up before them. I remember when I was in college, I had walked by a lecture on Plato. I decided to audit this class on Plato, and the lecture at the time was on Plato's Meno, which is about the question of what is virtue. And I was just struck by the fact that we could even ask that question in a university environment, because I had never expected that to be a subject of study, from my time, in the United States. And I think that this is the case with a lot of the students that I was talking to, is that they just were so surprised that they could study, Greek and Latin at Renmin University and be exposed to all these things that they could never have imagined. And I think that is partly why.
It's funny you mentioned Meno, because I remember the first time reading Confucius and being like, whoa, there's this entirely new way to conceptualize virtue. And
Right.
it's not Plato and it's not all just like Plato and Aristotle. So I definitely understand and empathize with having an entirely new civilization to explore is a really exciting prospect for sure.
Yeah, and I think Lieb is also very good at, one thing that I try to bring up is that he's just a comparative thinker of the nth degree. I mean, he's so good at drawing connections between East and West, and so I think he really plays a sort of bridge between Chinese civilization and Western civilization, and it makes Western civilization, seem digestible to a lot of young Chinese.
I thought would be fun to have for a guest is if there are any that journal, like the Chinese Journal of Classical Studies or whatever. If they have an editor or something who speaks English, that might be a fun guest too. I don't know if you've been in touch with them at all, or.
I haven't.
Okay.
But yeah, the Journal of Classical Studies, I mean, I think we can talk about it a little bit on the podcast, but my knowledge of it is not as deep as you might imagine. I mean, I haven't read any of the articles, but
Okay.
it's interesting to note that the journal So one thing I'll say about the journal, you can add this into the podcast. So the Journal of Classical Studies is a journal that includes all classics, like not just Chinese classics or Western classics, like all classical, texts and analysis are welcome in the journal. But it just so happens that I think like the majority of them are Western classics.
Coming back to the kind of idea of unearthing the sort of like roots of Western civilization, it's interesting because when I remember being pitched that line in like 7th grade when they were trying to talk folks into studying Latin. But in retrospect, it feels more like religion and Christianity is the tighter through line than classical than sort of the Greeks and Romans. And that isn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have like Western religious studies departments flowering all across China nowadays, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the ironies of this classics revival is that religion is almost wholly out of the picture, even though it is such a central part of the classics as we know it in the Greco-Roman antiquity. And part of that is for entirely political reasons. The CCP just does not has very strict rules about religion. And when I was doing the story, I know several of the teachers that I've talked to who have sort of religious backgrounds. They have said that oftentimes when they do religious kinds of work or teachings, they're not allowed to for example, if they're writing a book and they mention Jesus, and they're not allowed to have pictures, religious pictures. They're not allowed to have like explicit references to Christianity. So in that sense, the teaching of it is extremely hamstrung, I think.
Does this extend to mythology?
I'm not sure. My thinking is that at the moment is that I don't think so, because it's not. I think the biggest issue for the party is Christianity.
Global coverage of contemporary China. What's your take on how the world's doing?
So I think the first thing that I'll say is I think that there isn't enough coverage of China, just period. I think, China is the second largest economy, soon to be the first largest economy in the world. And part of this is anyone's fault. Part of this is just the fact that there isn't enough, China is a country where, journalists, it's hard for journalists to operate in the country, especially after this great expulsion of journalists. And I think what that's created is this huge, arbitrage opportunity where there's just a huge difference between importance and actual written coverage of it in English. It almost reminds me of how, a planned economy decides to make some kind of sudden move, and there's always some sort of inefficiency in the market afterwards. It's like China has decided that, they don't want, a whole lot of Western journalists covering the country. And so now there's this huge gap between what the world should know about China and what they need to know. And I think that is, it partly motivates my work. And I wish that, for the good of just the world, that we have more opportunities and for journalists to have more opportunities to cover the country.
So Chang, not asking you to sort of over culturally generalize, but you have spent, you did grow up in Japan. You've also spent a number of years in China in your life. What kind of cross-country observations, if any, would you like to share?
So I have spent some time in both countries, and as you can imagine, my friend group and my family, are very much sort of bicultural, and I'm surrounded by people who have deep affinities to both countries, and I think as someone who's spent time there, it's really striking to me how similar the two countries are in respect to culture and language. The written language was borrowed. Japan borrowed their written language from China. One thing that had always struck me was whenever I see Japanese and Chinese communicate, they always have to use English, and that had always found to seem to me so bizarre, because there's so many cultural affinities between the two countries that they have to use kind of outside Western language to interact. Was really striking. And it's in effect, it's a sort of reflection of, how modern history has gone. As we know, China and Japan do not have a particularly great relationship now, and it's been colored by geopolitics and allegiances with the varying degrees of allegiance and non-allegiance to the United States. And I think it's just, from my perspective, it's always been the case that the two countries are more similar than they are different. And to see the political aspect of it, it's really hard. And I think it's the same, I think, for those with just the U.S. China background. Some of the other journalists in the field who are Chinese Americans. I think I think saw Yang Chen wrote a piece, I think in Dissent magazine, about this as well. Seeing how people will ask, if U.S. and China go to war, who would you support? I mean, that's just a very difficult question for, I think, bicultural journalists.
Yeah, and like an awful question to ask someone. And
awful.
So Chang, I hear you got a book up your sleeve.
Yes, I'm working on a book, and it's about post-pandemic China and some of the changes that have been spurred from since the pandemic began, on a domestic level. And it's a book that's kind of split into, I think, 4 parts that I think has really sort of shifted gears in China since the pandemic began. The first is the one that I think most people are talking about, which is the economy, and the sort of shift from this kind of former economic model fueled by debt and infrastructure spending to something that we haven't fully figured out, and I don't think is actually fully formed. The second has to do with this education reform that's going on right now, in relation to, as I said, this kind of ballooning higher education system in China, and a sort of a revived system of vocational schools. The third is the technology crackdowns and this kind of this emergence of this new idea of Chinese innovation and what it means to be a technology superpower in this age of crypto and all these sort of new technologies. And the last is from drawing from my work from Wang Huning and cultural reforms and what that means for China's sort of cultural production. So there's kind of these 4 broad categories that I've been sort of working my way through and basically trying to tell different stories to sort of express how those changes are playing out now in post-pandemic China.
He's looking for a book deal. Chang's contact info is in the show notes. Let's close on some recommendations. What cultural products has you been enjoying of late?
So I want to recommend a book that I picked up from a bookstore recently by this historian named Tony Judt called "Ill Fares the Land." So the book was written in 2000, I think in the early 2000s, and it's a Tony Judt is a really astute historian of European history, and it's just kind of a really short political book about what has happened in the past sort of 3 or 4 decades of neoliberalism and how society has sort of moved away from moral questions to questions of efficiency and economic and thinking. And it's a good sort of companion to thinking about some of the issues that I think a thinker like Wang Huning and a lot of Chinese intellectuals see with America from an inside perspective, like an internal criticism of some of the issues that China sees in the West now. The other one is a music recommendation. I recently saw this live concert video on YouTube of Wolfpack, which is one of my favorite bands, and their performance at MSG. It was one of the greatest things that I've ever seen. So I highly recommend people look up Wolfpack. I think it was like in 2019, like live MSG. It's like a 1-hour show of like a camera guy just following all the band members on every song. It's absolutely astonishing and spectacular.
Chang, thanks so much for being part of China.
Thank you. That was fun.
要一条时，别超时，及时开始用时，1小时先找找词，话该怎么讲得先过过脑子，不是找事，不想搞事。别把家里说过要搞10个事，让你花5分43秒会觉得比较值。爱看热闹的说傻贼，说也钱坏了，你们要咋子就咋贼，都别点醉了，各位同也可以对了，当评委是林北，我明人不说暗话，更不会阳奉阴违。hiphop 可以炫，可以拽，可以显摆，说自己有多天才。这些年来，大家精妙的编排着得到市场的偏爱。我从蓬莱写到仙台，可不可耻是信手拈来。这里有周瑜，有黄盖，有人愿打，就有人愿挨，那就切磋切磋，好的分子结果，结果就当是球场接驳，我的得分会有写多。所谓电视上的 rapper， 极有可能就是写我的野朵，录下了电视的我 punch line 特别多，会吃票子票子，兄弟表当然必不可少。这些是生活的原动力，都想要过得好，但比说得溜，说得比迟早的这比更重要，因为给富二代官二代比钱根本比不了。爱听上海的政客教如何感觉太真了，一针见血的精准天王，我斗志都旺盛了。有些东西不能玩，有些想法不能瞒，有些问题不能谈，因为高处不胜寒，总是在不断说 RIP， 世界上总有人 RIP， 那还不如是我爱你。全职太极，我不想打太极，学哆来咪，扩宽英语做歌才能哆来咪。早起练声陶冶情操，别中你踩过我踩你，这一波直接炸掉，爆发像樱木花道，当清楚3月8号，在刘亚放大花炮。划破天空，炸个绿野仙踪，让我剑走偏锋，恩怨纠葛 pass out。哈，随便押韵会产生 problem。哈，让误会要升级该咋个整？这么大官的团体不可能听不到。你说这不是碰瓷，但我的心在砰砰跳。哈哈，随便押韵会产生 problem。哈，让误会要升级该咋个整？造成一点小风波是想让大伙好生说，因为只有好生说 rapper 才会有好生活。对了，拔河河没什可比的，假如这个比喻现在可比可，过去有不爽是合理的，但是地域歧视是不合理的。新仇旧恨了就了了，了到趁着来个彻底的。咱不是同一条船上的，但是同一条河里的。我问你，浏阳河流过了几道弯？出了个什么人？你的户口才能到街道办？别没事挑战多去研究 flow 的排法，莫来点清真来长沙才不用怕挨打。最尊重，所有地下再耕耘了地下党，保持独立独特独裁可没什么好下场。舞台上英姿飒爽，也祝贺你拿大奖。下次做那么近，不要再没什么话讲。哥们，我直言不讳，所以才不怕得罪这话，我必须说，就算埋下愤怒的种子。你看各大厂牌正在各就各位，中文说唱全部可能会被拉个筒子。Be humble, sit down， 一起往上走，即将把他们上头。激昂，朗朗上口的秘方，而整体上我也一样期待着 humble swag man， 要显得 humble 才能拥有那种 swag man。CDC CAC 服装里面会爆 man， 是 business man 就来点 business man。New school 哈 ，old school 哈，出了社会才知道这 no school 哈，让 hiphop 降临榜单冲上大荧幕哈，那不是强项 ，Let's study cool，Let's move， 重庆、西安、长沙或成都 ，That's cool， 南京、新疆、广州、上海的人物，即将和大家比赛，哥们从来不懈怠 ，MVP 有3座常规赛全明星，而我打到了总决赛，哈，随便押韵会产生 problem， 哈，让误会有升级该咋个整？这么大官的团体不可能听不到，你说这不是碰瓷，但我的心在砰砰跳，哈哈，随便押韵会产生 problem， 哈，让误会有升级该咋个整？造成一点小风波是让大伙都好生说，因为只有好生说 rapper 才会有好生活。从你争我抢，接着吃小笔账，你认真写，大家都会认真去听你讲，把嘴皮练娴熟，哪怕实力悬殊，期待下个人出现，说要跳我们全部，前提是有理有据，而且是有理有据，文笔的精湛和逻辑的清晰，全部井然有序，做出更屌的 cipher， maybe someone be better， 想带出2个 cipher 的精彩的程度盖味 I gotta go you gotta go， 天生 flow。You better know， 谁说的差，谁说的溜，谁长得帅，谁长得丑 ，whatever， 就当是我搞音乐比音乐高了。整年的好生说歌，谁都能买得起跑车。等点过，要是早点回来，肯定能现货。你沉淀过，有机会和 Nest 的一起沉淀过，在每一个人彻底放下心里的石头前，不管会馆还是集团，祝贺你们10周年。CSC，I make a city，hip hop GDP 都往上提。CSC，I make a city。所有 Chinese MC，Let's go and get it。